So, competence in Wonderland, a constructivist view here. What I mean by Wonderland, of course, is Alice in Wonderland. And specifically, what I'm referring to is not so much that particular book, but the subsequent one, Through the Looking Glass. And here is the famous quote from the Humpty Dumpty. He says, "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, nothing more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make the words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be the master, that's all." And this quote, to put it in context, came in after Alice had asked what something really meant. And clearly the answer that Lewis Carroll or Charles Dodgson is giving is that the word means what we choose it to mean, because that is the process whereby words are constructed. Years ago, I was in the midst of my studies of psycholinguistics and general semantics and other communication-oriented things. And I was asked the question, what is the most dangerous word in the English language? And after thrashing around a bit about that, the answer came out, the most dangerous word is the word is. And because the meaning of the word is implies that there is some kind of a priori meaning of that word that exists outside of the process whereby the word is being defined in some particular way. Words are perceptual representations, as people have been speaking here. They are the way, they're codes for our perceptual representation. They are not things that capture any kind of inherent meaning or a priori meaning that exists in the world outside of our definition of the term. Now, of course, I'm sure all of you would agree with this, but I think sometimes in semantic discussions, we lose sight of this, and if we don't lose sight of it at the specific level of definition, we may lose sight of it at a little deeper level of the kind of epistemological assumptions that we are making. Thus, I was so pleased to hear Professor Wieland speak of the epistemology of what he was referring to. So let me move into a case study of this. This is the general ravages of reification. Reification is the assumption that there is an a priori existence of something that's only implied by a construct or measurement. And this was famously referred to by Berger and Luckman in their social construction of reality. There it is. And let me read this to you because I think it's a rather interesting quote. The institutional world is objectivated human behavior. They made up that term, objectivated. And so is every single institution. In other words, despite the objectivity that marks the social world in human experience, it does not thereby acquire an ontological status apart from the human activity that produced it. Reification, as they say, implies that people, and this was written in 1967, that people are capable of forgetting their own authorship of the human world, and further that the dialectic between people, the producers, and their products is lost to consciousness. That is, people are capable, paradoxically, of producing a reality that denies them. And I think that's a dramatically important idea, that we are always in danger through the necessary reification of language. Otherwise, we can't coordinate our activities. We can't co-construct the commonalities that allow us to move forward in some way. But in the process of doing that, we necessarily reify the representation. And in so doing, we may forget our own authorship of that representation, and with very dangerous consequences. Let me give you one example of that. This is the curious case of intelligence. And here I'm referring to a number of authors that discuss this issue. The kind of summary of them is that the French educators, Binet is well known amongst them, are seeking a way to assign students to different schools. And as an auxiliary to the interviews, which were very cumbersome, given the number of students that they needed to be putting into either more vocational or more academic or other kinds of educational foci, they consolidated several quantitative measures into something that was kind of predictive. At least it informed their interviews, and they called it the G factor, believe it or not, general intelligence. Now that that continued to be a useful part of French educational efforts. But when it migrated to the United States, first through the UK and then to the United States, it became the Stanford Binet IQ test. And several assumptions were made by Tarman and others in doing so. One of them is that it acquired the assumptions that there is a consistent internal condition that causes the response. This is an expression of the kind of positivist or sort of Newtonian physical science perspective that was common at the time. And that because there is an actual existing internal condition that is normally distributed in the population, the scores can therefore also be normalized, and people can then be rank ordered in terms of their deviation from a baseline. You know, that is 1, 2, 3 standard deviations on either side, which is where we get the idea of IQ. I think that the point I would make here is that IQ has been constructed. It's been constructed, it's been reified as a human characteristic that has these more or less universal applicability. This is not to say that the IQ test might not be a useful thing, but to assume that because we are measuring something, therefore there must be something there, is a paradoxical assumption that is denying our authorship of exactly that condition. Now, I think there's an interesting parallel in intercultural and transcultural competence, whichever we call it. That initially anthropologists and others, Edward G. Hall specifically amongst them, observes that some people are better than others at adapting their behavior in cross-cultural situations. How about that? And all of us can go out and observe that. And they then develop tools that could be used for training people to improve that cross-cultural performance. And we should remember that the genesis of all of this intercultural work or transcultural work that we're talking is a kind of practical need to do something, to improve something, in this case, our relationships, intergroup relations. So implicitly following the model of IQ, and I'm not sure that this was conscious, I suspect not, but nevertheless implicitly doing so, researchers in psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and intercultural communication are seeking to measure this internal constellation of factors. And there's all kinds of arguments that most of you are familiar with about what exact constellation of factors are the most predictive of this external behavior that we're calling intercultural competence. But we're not just restricting it to the behavior. We're saying that there are these internal conditions which must be causing that behavior, so that if we only identify what those conditions are, we will then be able to perhaps address those conditions in some way so as to increase the likelihood of the behavior. What this is doing is following pretty much the idea of IQ, of intelligence, with the possible and maybe paradoxical assumption that yes, it's an inherent quality, but we can change it through good training. Let me suggest a de-reification of this, and this is a kind of, and there are some general principles that I'll be trying to illustrate as we de-reify the notion of competence. And once again, let me say that this does not mean that this is an unnecessary or useless concept in any way whatsoever. What I'm implying here is that we need to be constantly remembering our authorship of this for some reasons that I'll mention at the end. So the first question we ask is, what is the behavior in cross-cultural situations that we wish to ascribe the term competence? What do we want to describe? Do we want to talk about people interacting between so-called minority groups and majority groups? Do we want to look at, do we want to include cross-racial, cross-gender, cross-status, cross-generational, as well as cross-national and other kinds of conditions? Of course, from a constructivist perspective, we're constructing those boundaries that differentiate those groups in the first place. So we're basically just arguing about what kind of boundary conditions that we want to include in this. One way to think about what we mean by competence is to think about what it means to be competent in your own culture. And then we could say, well, how close can you get to that level of sort of natural competence that you have in your own culture in some other cultural contexts? And how then can you be attentive to the interface, the in-betweenness that we've been discussing here, that's generated by an attempt at mutual adaptation? How do we in general become competent in doing that? This is the point that came up in the last panel. And as most of you know, this is a lot of my work is around this kind of developmental process. But what we're trying to do here is to figure out how can we facilitate the process of getting better at this. And I think the hint about this, or the model we could be looking at, is how does secondary socialization work in general? I mean, how do you become educated in a new thing? How do you learn a new expertise? Even something simple. How do you learn to ride a bicycle? These all may be things that are not natural to our human condition. There are not many things that are natural to our human condition that we nevertheless can see as models for how to approach the idea of development. And of course, the DMIS is one example of that. And finally then, so how could we help people get competent? And here we can look at all kinds of state-of-the-art educational methods, which are basically oriented around how do you get people to have more expertise in something. I would add parenthetically here that I believe expertise is not at all a cognitive issue. I mean, there may be a cognitive component to it, but I think expertise is largely around the experience of experiencing something in a more complex way, in a more nuanced way. And going back to the idea of unity and diversity, I would say that the developmental movement along a continuum, let's say, of becoming more interculturally competent or sensitive, as I use the term, would be to be able to deal with similarities and differences in more nuanced ways. That is, to integrate them, to be able to see where sometimes it might be better to look at one or the other, to be able to maintain both of them together as a dialectic and so forth. And that as one becomes more expert, one becomes better at doing that, as one would do getting better at anything. So when we're constructing a definition, and here I'm taking this kind of Wonderland idea of the words mean exactly what we say that they mean, is let's be intentional, first of all, by constructing what we want to pay attention to. And I hear this happening a lot so far in this meeting, and I'm very pleased to hear that. Do we want to see how people are behaving appropriately or effectively in cross-cultural situations? Do we want to help them do that better? Do we want to incorporate an economic dimension to this, a value, transactional value perspective? All we need to do is to recognize what it is that we want to be paying attention to, and that then establishes the boundary conditions, or as George Kelly talks about it, the range of convenience of the model that we come up with. Then we construct an embodied explanatory process. And I say embodied to once again be explicit about the idea that this is not a cognitive process. We can talk about it cognitively, but in fact, it's developing an explanatory process that explains how it is that our experience is moving into this greater level of expertise. And I'm using, again, expertise in the general sense. And one key to this, which I've used a lot, and I was pleased to hear Professor Wieland as well mention it, is to use verbs, not nouns. So we don't talk about identity, because that in itself is a reification. We talk about belonging, which is the process which we could then refer to as identity, but we ought not ever to forget that the way we're getting to that noun is through the verb of belonging. Finally, we can describe some descriptive name to that phenomenon. And I would say the criterion for this descriptive name should be the one that's least loaded with implications of internal or external causality. That's least loaded with those implications. And what I think that means is that if people generally think that intercultural refers to set national units, then yeah, perhaps we should be avoiding that term. I personally don't use the term that way. I don't think that it was at least intended to refer to that, but of course some people use that. Just like some people use the idea of transcultural to refer to the existence of some external transcendent reality that is either the aspiration or possibly some kind of synthesis of a thesis and antithesis. Final thoughts I have about this: commonalities and differences probably are necessary reifications, so forth for transcultural and intercultural, but we just should not forget our authorship of them. When we remember our authorship, I think there really are profound implications. It is and should be a humbling thing. There is no problem. There is nothing we can describe that is disconnected from our own collective responsibility. And this, just to bring up a point that somebody will if I don't, is that, well, aren't there people who are victims of oppressors that in fact are not responsible for that? And yes, at a given point in time, you can say, here are the oppressors, here are the victims, and how it is that the victims really don't have much to say about the oppression that they're experiencing. And yet, in the larger sense, we as human beings are collectively responsible for the social conditions that we are creating. And granted, at a particular moment, that may not be the case. But as I watch the current Black Lives Matter protests, the piece of it that strikes me as being most powerful is the idea not that we will ask you, the oppressors, to stop oppressing us, but that we ourselves will we, in the sense of the people who are protesting, will take the responsibility of being more active participants in the society that we are collectively creating. I think that is, in fact, an empowering position, and that we, all of us, are empowered by remembering our authorship.